Hello cult hackers and welcome to the podcast. I'm Celine, a media graduate with an interest in cults.
And I'm Stephen Mather. I'm a organisational psychologist. I was raised in a cult. I happen to be Celine's dad. So today we're going to talk about a topic that I've been writing about, and so I've been doing quite a bit of research and thinking about it, so we thought it would be a good topic to talk about. And then if you're interested in reading a bit more about it, you can go to the blog. So we're talking today about what I'm calling a bug in the system. So I think I'm proposing that human beings have a kind of software bug that makes us susceptible to cultic involvement or to being influenced by cults, joining cults, and so on. So that's my kind of provocation, I suppose. And then, of course, I need to be able to demonstrate that. So that's the topic. The provocation is that we are all born with a bit of a software glitch, if you like, or like a security weakness in our operating system. And it's that cults expose, and it's that they take advantage of.
Before we get into the meat, what made you want to go for a computer bug? Like, what started you on that?
Do you know what? I actually don't know. As I was writing it, it did occur to me that somebody that's been on the podcast before, Daryl Ray, who is an absolute gem. He's brilliant. He's the guy that wrote the God virus. And I suppose I thought, well, am I sort of stealing his idea? And it wasn't conscious. If I was, I didn't do it consciously. But I'm thinking of it not so much as a sort of virus, as a real bug, but more as a kind of software glitch. And I feel like there's
bug is the right term, isn't it? It doesn't have to be something that's introduced. Bugs can be errors, gaps, issues.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So it's a type of software glitch. I mean, I'm so old. I remember very, very well the Millennium bug and the fears over what might happen at the turn of the millennium. It was all to do with the way that dates were stored in memory. Instead of 4 digits, it was stored as 2.
I watched a YouTube video recently about it, talking about the sort of millennium bug hysteria. I can't remember. It was quite good, actually, because it showed some of the stuff that was being made at the time. And people that were like, not letting their kids go out for the millennium things. I thought it was all hell was going to break loose.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite. It is. We shouldn't get too down that rabbit hole because we could get into it. But there is. I think it's one of those things that's in the eye of the beholder in some respects. What lessons you learn from it. So, on the one hand, it's like apocalyptic doom, which we know quite well, and the end of the world is coming. Scare, 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 scare. On the other hand, it was a known fault that was identified, and people didn't quite know what was going to happen when these dates clicked into 00, because from a technical standpoint, that meant that there was no date. How would the systems respond to that? And actually what happened is lots of work was done on systems to stop it from happening. So it was a known fault. We worked on it. We stopped it happening. And then, of course, everybody turns around and says, see, there's nothing to worry about. Well, yeah, because everybody did a lot of work. Whether it would have had the, apocalyptic ending if we hadn't have done anything, I can't say, but surely we want to be able to identify potential risks, do something about it, and then be able to look back and say, well, I'm glad we did something about that. That actually made a difference. So it's interesting.
Well, shall we?
But anyway, we're not talking about the millennium bug today. We're talking about the cult bug, the cultic bug in our system.
Let's do it. Start at the beginning. Go.
So, shall I give you the 3
triggers off.
factors or facets about human psychology that makes us susceptible to cults. So the first one is our attraction to stories, the way we respond to stories. The second one is our desire to find a tribe. And the third is our tendency to go in for hero worship. So those are the three psychological tendencies that I would suggest most of us, if not all of us to some degree, have, that makes us by our very nature susceptible to cults. And because we all have these three things, we are all at risk in one way or another.
So you said that these are all working together rather than in stages. Is that what you're saying? So they're not. It's not like one follows by two, follows by three.
Correct. Yeah. And they kind of feed on one another. So maybe I should sort of take them step by step.
Yeah.
So the first one is this, our attraction to stories. So one of the things that I think I've become more and more interested in over the years, really since leaving Jehovah's Witnesses, I think, is this thing around stories and how attracted and interested we are in stories. So one of the things that I think frustrates scientists sometimes and, rational researchers is that you can present a whole case for something with a bunch of data, with proper statistics that demonstrate that this is going to cause that and that this relates to that. There's a correlation here, there's a correlation there, there's a causal effect here, and you can demonstrate with data and sometimes even with experiment that there's something here that we need to do or stop doing that's going to have an impact. But people don't really respond to that very well. So in my blog piece that I've been writing, I used the example of seatbelts in cars. So I'm old enough to remember when in the UK they introduced, the law was introduced, that you had to wear seatbelts in the front of a car. They started at the front to start with. So you had to wear seatbelts. Up until that point, you didn't have to.
So they were there, but they were optional.
Often they were there, sometimes they weren't. I mean, again, the laws around making them in the car, that came earlier. So in the very early examples, there wasn't any seatbelts at all. But by the time they introduced the law, all cars, A, had to have seatbelts, and B, you had to use them in the front of the car, unless they were a very old car, or you were like in a milk float. We used to have electric milk floats that did like 5 miles an hour or something.
Yeah, because you're going so slow.
And you were jumping in and out all the time. So there were certain exemptions. Milk floats delivering milk, bottled milk. I think even the postal service perhaps didn't have to. And when you were reversing, you could take it off. But other than that, everybody had to wear them. And there was lots of statistics about the importance of wearing seatbelts and why you should wear them and so on and so on. But the really impactful messages came from the TV ads. So I remember the TV adverts, and they were very simple. They were interviews, short interviews with people sat in front of the camera just talking about their experience. They often had scars on their face because they were people that had a crash and literally flown through the windscreen, and their faces were all cut to ribbons by the windshield, the glass windscreen. And often they'd say it was always the same story, or often the same story. I was so close to home, I didn't think it was going to matter. I could actually see my house from where it happened. Of course, when you're traveling at 30 miles an hour or more and you hit something and you stop dead, the inertia means that you carry on traveling at 30 miles an hour. And if you don't go through, you're going to smash your face against something. If you go through the windscreen, obviously that's quite disastrous as well. You'll go through it, you get cut, and obviously you're in the road then. So these stories of people actually talking about what had happened to them, this happened to me, and they tell about how long it took them to recover and all of that. And it was those stories that were really impactful, and I still remember some of them today. And this is 40 years later. It's about 40 years ago.
Yeah, they still do those sorts of things, don't they?
That's
I
right.
remember there was a lot that were quite disturbing, because a lot of them are around car safety that I remember, but the other one was around driving at 30 in residential areas, because it can save like a child's life if your stopping time is better, and or if you do hit someone, they're like much more likely to survive, aren't they, at 30?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there was lots
And
of stories about that.
it's the stories, yeah. So you can tell people the facts, but it's the stories that really make the difference. So I think that's, we see loads and loads of examples. An anecdote seems to be much more powerful than a whole bunch, a paper full of statistics and details and so on and so on. Tell a good story, and that's what really affects people. Either way,
I mean, I just thought as well, sometimes, when people get frustrated, actually, this might help with understanding that. When people get frustrated when, maybe you say, people say to men around the Me Too movement, imagine if it was your daughter, your sister, da da da. But I suppose it's making it that story impact rather than a statistical one, because there's a lot of statistics
absolutely.
obviously around, workplace misconduct, or all the stuff around the Me Too movement. There's a lot of stats on that, but I think imagining it in your head as a story.
Absolutely, absolutely. And the more real you can make it, the more impactful it is. So if it's happened to somebody that you know or love, then that's even more powerful, because obviously the story is closer to home, which relates to another one of the factors that I'll talk about in a minute. But yeah, so stories are so deeply embedded in our culture. It's what we've used for thousands and thousands of years to make sense of the world. So in my head, I've got this picture of ancient human beings sat around a fire telling stories, and talking about this happened to me and this happened to him, and then there's fictional stories, from which comes a lot of the myths and legends and ancient tales that we still have today. These stories have come down to us from thousands of years ago, and they give us a sense of understanding the world. It's something like a statistical model or an experiment that you can draw correlations from cause and effect. That these are very new ways of thinking. We are not wired to really go with that. We are wired to listen to a story, to think about the story, to think about how it might affect us, and then we use that as a way to make sense of the world. And so we're I don't like the term, it's not very scientific, but we are kind of hardwired for stories. We are primed for them. And if you think about the cultures in the world, they all have stories, and often they're similar stories. There's always stories about heroes, which we'll get to. There's stories about struggles and tragedy, and overcoming these tragedies. There's often like an origin story. Even in business, there'll be an origin story of the business. This person invented computer software in their garage. The whole Bill Gates, Steve Jobs thing. They did this in their garage, and then they did this, and then they did that. Or they sold stuff out the back of their car. Then next thing you know, they've got a department store. These stories are just so powerful. So even organizations have stories, origin stories, good times, bad times.
I think the thing that I want to pick on, just in case I forget, is that I think stories are important, and we don't want to say that we're saying that like stories are in themselves a bad thing because they're a bug. Do you know what I mean? Because I think they are really important, and they help with feeling part of a team at work. Like, it's not saying that at work it's bad for businesses to use that, because it does help, feeling part of the team, part of the story involved, and or using it to good benefit, like you said, with the seatbelts, or with driving at safer speed limits. Some of the stories around, like, protections for people around drink safely, like the Frank adverts, things like that. You know, it does have benefits, and it can really help in movements. You know, I think, I mean, our whole podcast is listening bi-weekly to people's stories,
Absolutely.
so I
Yeah.
think, you know, there's a massive benefit. I think I'm just gonna sort of throw this out there, and you tell me because you've done more research. But I think when it becomes dangerous or worrying, or maybe you might be looking at a hijacking issue, like cultiness, is when it doesn't go further than the story. Because at least if you get hooked in with the story, then you can go into the data, or you can look at the research, go further. You know that it's all part of a greater whole. Whereas things like, immediately my brain went to Holmes with the Theranos scandal.
Elizabeth
Oh
Holmes.
god, yeah. Oh no, that's someone I work with. Cut that out. You can bleep it if you want, and then
Right, okay, that'll be good.
yeah. So just bleep the full thing out.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Elizabeth Holmes with the Theranos scandal, she had great stories. You know, the stories were great.
Yeah.
The origin story was great. The story of the brand was great, and what it was going to do was great. You know, all of the stories, brilliant, but it didn't have anything to back it up. So I think that's when you can sort of see the issues. I don't know if that leads into anything you've been thinking about.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that is so. First of all, I just want to completely agree and absolutely, you know, very, very underline that in a very, very bold way. That I'm not trying to say that we should all stop using stories to explain things and to make sense of things, because we can't, we shouldn't, and they are beautiful. I mean, stories are the most beautiful piece of art. You know, we have stories on tap now. You go to
Yeah,
Netflix and
they're
you
the
look at all your
underpinning of all
stories.
art. Every piece of art has a story.
Absolutely.
If it's a painting, it tells a story. If it's a song,
Yes.
if it's a film, it's telling a story. It's just doing it in different ways. They're all mediums, but creative
It's
work is
absolutely.
storytelling.
It's very much who we are, you know. So without stories, we are nothing, I think, as human beings. We are just machines. Stories are what makes us human. So no, I'm not trying to say that stories are a bad thing in any way. In fact, none of these things are bad in themselves. What happens is they are, it's almost like because of our nature that we've developed over thousands and thousands of years of evolution, we have these tendencies that can then be exploited. So just like the recording of the date of 00 in the year 2000, because we didn't think of that, or it wasn't considered important when there was only 2 digits in the year element of the date, that was fine when it was, you know, 78 or 80 or 90 or 99. But then at some point it starts to become a bug. So it wasn't a bug at the start, then it becomes a bug because of the situations change. And so, yeah, in other words, it can be exploited, or circumstances mean that there's something that it creates a problem for us later. And absolutely, again, I totally agree with you. In fact, it is a core part of this model, this theory, if you like, that this is how cults operate. This is how cult leaders operate. Cult leaders are nearly always, in fact, I would say always, great storytellers. At least the beginnings of the cult are. They might hand over to some kind of boring, faceless individual who's an administrator after that. But in the early days, if you think about all the cults that we've talked about, they're always started by somebody who's a great storyteller. So cults and stories, you know, they use these stories very, very well. There's often a origin story of the cult or the cult leader, and so on and so on and so on. So it is very much related to that. So yeah, stories, our love of stories, our attraction to stories, the way that we make sense of the world through stories means that we are susceptible to a great storyteller. We're a sucker for a great story, basically. And so that's the first of the bug, if you like, the software bug. Okay, the second one is finding a tribe. I think we all agree that human beings are social creatures, and there's lots of good reasons for that. Obviously, we, as mammals particularly, tend to have groups, or we live in groups. Not always, but generally. So, and there's lots of advantages in that. You know, you're protected. You can protect each other. You can mating is easier because you've got available mates. Sometimes you look after each other's young. And so, yeah, you look at mammals, including humans, and we are social creatures. And human beings feel psychologically safe when we are feeling that we are belonging. If you remember back to the ABC of conspiracy theories, I mentioned that, or why we're attracted to them, I mentioned that the belonging bit is very important. And so, yeah, we want to belong. We want to be part of this, of this community, of this greater community, something greater, something bigger. But this also links into this story bit because, of course, stories reinforce this sense of community. There's a shared history. There's common values. We've got this destiny that we can achieve together. We support each other. We tell stories about each other. So stories relates to this too. But the communal element, the fact that we want to be part of a tribe, is so strong that we will forgive our tribe or members of our tribe all sorts of terrible things, and will defend our tribe even when deep down we know they've done wrong. You know, there's lots of stories around one person going and doing something terrible and then the whole tribe having to defend them. This is a very common trope. Even in the Bible, there's a story about that. So we'll defend our tribe, even though what they're doing, maybe as an individual, we don't like, but we'll defend them anyway because they're part of our tribe. Again, this is a very, very powerful natural instinct. We want to be part of a tribe. We want to feel the protection of the tribe. We're willing to allow the tribe to do things that we're a bit icky about, but we'll accept it anyway, and we'll justify actions of the tribe because they are our tribe. So, you know, that becomes this important social group. And cults nearly always involve joining the tribe, joining the new community, joining this wonderful place, these happy, shiny people, these people that are there for us. And it doesn't take us long to start to feel that sense of safety and that they've got our back, and we've got theirs. And it's the us and them factor then that starts to kick in. We've talked about Tajfel before around our tendency to have in groups and out groups. This is just another way of describing this tribal nature that we have. Thank you for listening to Cult Hackers, an indie podcast. That means we're not part of a big media organisation with huge advertising budgets and massive reach. So just by listening to this, you're supporting the little guy. The hardest thing for us is not content. We love recording episodes and talking to amazing and interesting people. No, by far the hardest thing is getting in front of the potential millions of listeners out there with millions of podcasts scrambling for attention. And here's where you can help. Simply by telling people about the podcast. Just telling somebody about it can really help. You can share an episode on social media or private messaging using your app, or on some apps you can leave a rating, and better still, say a few words. So please help us get Cult Hackers in front of more people. And now back to the podcast.
So obviously we talked very positively about why stories are important. Obviously with, you know, tribal mentality, and you sort of mentioned why historically it was important. Would you say that sort of having a tribe is still important today and now?
Yeah, I do think it is still very important. I mean, the word tribe perhaps carries with it some baggage. The first time I heard that used in this way, actually, it goes back to Seth Godin. So this is going back sort of 10, 15 years. I remember watching a TED talk. So this was just at the beginning of TED Talks, and I was listening to him, and he talked about the thing for the future. He said, "Our tribes. It's all about tribes," and he was so right. This was way before we sort of saw all the tribal stuff, I suppose. But whatever the tribe is, sometimes it's about the music you like, or the football team you're into, or what you like to do for leisure. Of course, sometimes it's religion, sometimes it's your ethnicity, whatever it is. There is
it can
a
be
need to
small
feel
things and
part
big
of something.
things, like being a minimalist. That's not necessarily, it's, I guess it's just those tags that you put, and in a bio it says, what are some things about you? Some ists and some isms.
That's right. Yeah.
Ists and isms.
That's right. So yeah, it's very important. I guess that the nature of tribes has changed now. So it used to be that your tribe always was close geographically, so there would be people that lived next to you essentially. But now, because of our communication, the internet and social media and so on, our tribe can be scattered throughout the whole planet. And I think that is how new tribes are developing.
It's very nice, but also I think sad in some ways, like in that I do wish my friends were all nearby and I could invite them round anytime. But it's, orchestrating multiple people from different parts of the UK into a house for a weekend, But, you make it work, like you say. Tribal doesn't mean to be next door anymore.
It used to, clearly, before we had all these communication devices, but now it's I feel like the I suppose the ex communities, ex Jehovah's Witnesses, ex Mormons, ex fundamentalists, and so on. You start to develop new groupings and new groups that you associate with, and then they'll split off a bit more because not everybody sees things the same way. So you'll have this in some respects factionalization, but ultimately what's happening is you're finding your tribe. And again, in itself, there's nothing wrong with that. It's normal to want to feel close to others. It's to be part of something. It's absolutely fundamental. We shouldn't try to stop it because we can't. We can't. The vast majority of us need each other, and we feel safety and security in a tribe. It's as old as human beings have been around.
Yeah, identity needs it as well.
Absolutely, it becomes part of your identity too. Yeah. So that's the second factor.
Yeah, I suppose just the little flip side before we go on is just I think the only time when maybe again you might want to be like, oh, because what I was saying, it's positive, but you might want to be wary, might just be if you feel that not having that as part of your identity would be like, would ruin your life. Do you know what I mean? Like how impactful it would be. And I think it's not to say that if you're like, no, I absolutely need to carry on doing XYZ, if you are religious and that matters a lot to you, it's not always a cult, but or if you give up meat and you don't want to go back on your morals for that, but there's certain times where you might be able to see it taking on a cultic shape if you just consider how attached am I to this and how impactful would it be if I wanted to leave? Would I be able to leave this tribe, this group?
Absolutely, and the extra factor is the one that I'm going to come to now, because it's here where things start to, I suppose, take shape. So I've in my blog I've described what we've got so far as like the fertile ground for the hero. So we've got a tendency for us to be really attracted to great stories, and we've got this need to be part of a tribe or a group. So that the third element now is the hero. So step forward, the hero. And if we think about stories, there's nearly always a hero at the center of the story. And it's the hero's journey that we really care about. It's the hero that sets the standards of behavior that we want to be like. It's the hero that we all cohere around that becomes kind of the central point. The fact that they are as they are means we want to be near them, we want to be close to them, and we want them to like us. We get a feeling of safety and security when they show us attention, you know, and so they're wrapped up then in this sense of belonging. Of course, there's also lots of stories about the hero, and as we've already said, the origin story, and it means that they start to take on this other character that is better than the rest of us, really. So I was thinking about how you could then start to look at this from the other perspective, because I think so far we've talked about it from the ordinary person's perspective, but I want to now just think about it from the hero's perspective themselves. If you were to say, okay, I'm a budding hero, what do I need to do in order to benefit from these conditions that I find myself in, then I think the answer to that question is charisma. So the way that the hero can exploit or can take advantage of these psychological tendencies, these traits, is by using charisma. And it's through that charismatic character that the person, then the hero, can get people to do the things that we know happen in cults and in other sort of abusive situations.
Yeah, with the charismatic lead. So you're saying it's kind of would you say that's something that's a chosen thing, like they choose to try and put on a charismatic personality, or are they kind of naturally charismatic people that then
I think probably not. Not necessarily. In fact, I think most of the time it's just a kind of unconscious set of behaviors and characteristics that people have. Sure, I think some people do exploit that, and I'm sure there are some that sit in the darkened room and think about, right, how do I do this to exploit people? I'm sure that does happen.
Sometimes with these documentaries and things like this, it comes across as there's like a mastermind that has a room with plans and blueprints and red string. And I think generally these people are awful, these cult leaders, and they need to be punished, obviously, for the crimes that they commit. But I suppose it almost still follows through this hero narrative that they're so clever and smart and amazing, when actually they're, maybe some of them are smart, but, you think with the NXIVM leader, he was, touting himself to be a genius, with all these talents and, like you say, elevating himself to be this heroic figure. And then in some ways, all that you do is you sort of flip them into a supervillain, and they maintain this certain level above ordinary people, but all that has happened is they're still just ordinary people. They're just taking advantage of pre-existing situations.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, they're taking advantage of the fact they're great storytellers. They can tell a great story. They are taking advantage of the fact that they have created a community of sorts, or they encourage people to be part of a community. And again, this is exploiting this natural tendency that we have. So yeah, I want to focus on charisma a little bit. We have talked about it a bit on the podcast, and I don't really apologize for that, because I think it's, oh God, I sounded like the governing body then. We don't apologize for it. But I don't think it's anything to be ashamed of, because I think charisma is such an important element. I've spoken before about how in my old group, Jehovah's Witnesses, the governing body are about as charismatic as a piece of coal.
Wet rag.
Wet rag, exactly. But I think that's partly because they are the administrators that have come after the charismatic character. I don't know much about Russell and Rutherford, but I think they were probably quite charismatic in their own way. And I also think that within congregations, you've often got a charismatic head of the congregation, if you like, or a couple of elders who carry that role. So, yeah, I think that there are charismatic characters, but the actual governing body are not. But yeah, nearly all these groups have this person. So let's just talk about charisma. So it's a bit of a contested term in psychology. It's an area that I've studied a fair bit. I talk about it on my management training courses because charismatic and transformational leadership, which is kind of the umbrella over which charismatic sits, is in many respects seen as quite admirable. So this is somebody that aligns the team goals with the individual's identity and their own goals. So if as a team I can align the team goals to what people really care about, so essentially you're achieving the team goals by also achieving your own goals, or it's matched to your values, what you think is important, and that's great. So people tend to like that, and when leaders are doing that, they respond well to that. So that's generally considered a good thing. There's an element of risk taking by the leader. So, I'm going to put myself out there. So charismatic people put themselves out there, maybe physically and metaphorically, so they'll stand up and they'll make a stand. This is a kind of courageous looking hero. This is the person who takes the risk first, and then others will follow, and again, there's nothing wrong in that. In fact, there's nothing wrong in charisma per se, just like there's nothing wrong in loving stories and wanting to belong. So the charismatic person isn't a bad person because they're charismatic. The cult leader is bad because they're using that charisma to get what they want from people, and they're not in their interests.
Use of manipulation.
Exactly, but to their own ends, not in the service of the individual themselves, but to their own benefit. So the cult leader gets rich, the people who follow them live in poverty. The cult leader is sexually satisfied, but the followers have to service him, in the case of some groups, and so on. I won't go through all the different examples, but that's the point. The leader is using those skills to get what they want at the expense of their followers. There's also theories around the idea that the charismatic leader is helping the individual or making them believe. Again, if it's ethical, then this belief will be true. If it's unethical, then this would be an abuse of this power. But they help the follower to believe that by being part of this thing, they are going to achieve some personal psychological needs, or those will be fulfilled. So we've talked about this before, but the need for self-esteem, the need to feel that we are competent, that we have agency, that we can achieve things. These are natural psychological needs. And if the cult leader is able to convince you that by doing this thing, you'll be able to have more feelings of competence, more feelings of self-esteem, more feelings of achievement, then obviously, again, they can get you to do things. If those things are in the individual's own interest, then that's fine. But if they're not, if they're in the interest of the cult leader and to the expense of the follower, then that's when it's unethical. That's a cult. So that's kind of, am I explaining that well? Or well enough? And the other way of thinking about charisma is John Antonakis, his assessment. He's kind of not newest, but he's one of the newest researchers. He's actually kind of changed the way he does his research. And he's used an experimental model where he's actually saying charisma is primarily about signaling. It's about communication and signaling to others that, you know what, I'm such a confident, brilliant person that, again, I can take some risks. So if you see like a really exciting, inspirational speech or lecture or talk, that great speaker will be doing some fairly risky things, you know, so they'll be telling jokes. Telling jokes is quite risky because you never know for sure if people are going to laugh. They sometimes talk about their own weaknesses. This is quite risky because people might think you're not very good, but a charismatic person is willing to expose potential weaknesses. They're very animated. They put themselves out there. The person that is worried about looking stupid or feeling foolish, they're the ones who stand there with their hands by their sides and just mumble something because they're so self-conscious. The charismatic person, they're all over the place, you know. They're talking loudly. They may be singing. They may be moving around the stage. This is charisma. They are confident. They believe in themselves. And it's that they're signaling to their followers. So you only need to think about a charismatic preacher as a great example of that. So these are all different facets of charisma. And what I'm saying is that a charismatic leader who uses those techniques to appeal to these inherent traits, the fact that we love stories, the fact that we want to belong, and the fact that we're always ready to find a hero, they exploit that weakness. Just like an unethical hacker sitting in their bedroom is thinking about how can I hack this firewall to get into the system. Essentially, that's what they're doing. They're hacking our operating system to get us to join whatever group it is. And that's how cults operate. That's the bug. So yes, it's a bug, but it's really about the exploitation of that by these unscrupulous people.
So I suppose now we understand that you promised some solutions.
Right. Yeah. So before I go there, I'm going to get maybe a teensy weensy bit controversial because I've been thinking about whether there are more cults now than there were, or whether we live in a culty world, or whether it's just that we're noticing it more. And it could even be down to the fact that you and me, are talking about it a lot. And so you notice things that you are talking about. That itself is a psychological thing. It has a name. It's called the Bieder-Meinhof effect, which we'll talk about another day. But if you talk about cults a lot, you'll notice them a lot. So is that all that's happening, or is there something else happening? I gave this a lot of thought, and I can't give you any statistics for it. I don't know how you'd research that, but I do think we live in a world that has become more dangerous around this sort of cultic exploitation. That doesn't mean that I think everything I don't like is a cult, but I think that the way that we have this polarized world, and this knowing who your tribe is, knowing who your side is, I do feel that is quite dangerous, and that's turning us into, it's doing the same things. Let's put it that way. So if I look at a Trump rally, you know, those people really do look like they see him as a hero. There's all sorts of artwork around Trump and the fact that he's this and he's this and he's this. If you were to say to any of those individuals, what about what he did here or there, they would have none of it. Recently, Elon Musk has been, behaving quite strangely, really, and he's said some very odd things about his platform and to his potential advertisers, his customers. And yet, if you criticize him, you'll get jumped on all over by a bunch of Elon Musk supporters who see him as a hero. You know, he is again a hero. But then you could look at the left and you could say, what about, you know, how easy is it for people who loved Obama, for instance, to say, really didn't like this that he did here. This was completely wrong, this thing he did here. And there's plenty of that to go around if you actually look at some of the things that the Obama government did or didn't do. In the UK, there's Jeremy Corbyn, again, sort of a hero of the left, former Labour leader. So for me, you said, right, okay, what are the answers?
How do we bolster ourselves?
I think, how do we bolster ourselves? So I think first thing we need to do is be aware. So the fix, the patch that we need to put onto our operating system is, I believe, and I've been thinking about this a lot about myself, is to think about, right, am I willing to, first of all, I need to acknowledge that I have this tendency, like we all do, to be attracted to stories, great stories. And I love a great story and I want to hear more stories. I also want to belong to a tribe, and I worry about not being part of that tribe anymore, because where would you go? This is the fear of all cult members. If you get kicked out of your tribe, where are you? You're in the wilderness then. You're outside of that. So we have this tendency. We also have the tendency to want to find heroic figures. I love this guy. I love this person. They're brilliant. Look at how wonderful they are. So I have these tendencies. So I need to be clear about that. I need to acknowledge that. I want to know that I recognize that I have those traits like everybody else does. And I think it's okay to have, of course, it's okay to have heroes. It's okay to have people you admire. It's okay to recognize that the qualities in other people. But I do think it's important to be able to recognize that no one is worthy of our adulation to that nth degree, and what I've said at the end of my blog is that if you think about somebody that you really admire, can you think about something about them that they've done or something that they do that you don't like, or an opinion you really disagree with, something that you really don't agree with about
reverse
them?
Empathy.
Yeah, and if you can't think of a single thing, then I think it could just be that you don't know them that well. But I think for most people, if we've got that commitment to them, and we can't think of anything that they've ever done that we disagree with or that we're willing to admit to somebody else, then that's kind of what I'm talking about here. At that point, you might say, maybe that's kind of it. So I think that's the protection. It's the willingness to admit, not when we're wrong, but when our heroes are wrong, when the things they've done that we don't agree with, or the bits of the belief system or the way of thinking that we don't accept. And that is the difference between if you go to a church and you say, well, I like going because I like this and I like that, but I don't really agree what they say about that. That's a normal church. That's a normal religion. If you go to a place of worship where you have to accept everything without question, is it a cult? It's pretty much a cult. So again, it's about sort of recognizing that and being willing to see the bits that we don't like, the flaws. So that's my thinking around that.
To be fair, that was quite well done, wasn't it? That's probably because you wrote a blog about it. You knew where you were going, didn't you? You had a plan. Man with a plan.
Yeah. So if you're, as a listener, if you think that's kind of interesting, you want to read about it, then the blog is on Medium. I'll put the link to it. I have sort of had it in front of me as we've spoken, so I've used it as a bit of a prompt. So some of what I've said there will be directly in there, and there's other things that I've talked about. If you disagree with that, then of course, brilliant. If you totally disagree with everything I've said, then that's absolutely brilliant. And I do think there is something here also about people that talk about this stuff also need to be willing to be shown to be wrong. And sometimes that also becomes quite difficult we have seen cases in the X communities where people have become lauded, and they themselves then almost become that sort of person that we've just described. So yeah, and it's such a tendency, we want to say, oh, they're great, they're wonderful, they're the person I'm with. In my last podcast that I did with Spencer, I talked about Christopher Hitchens. So Christopher Hitchens is a guy that a lot of the people that leave religions, especially fundamentalist religions, and if they happen to be like me, atheists or agnostics, then they gravitate towards people like Christopher Hitchens. He's dead now, obviously, but he was a great orator. He was a great debater, very eloquent, and had loads of great qualities. But he was also a bit of an arsehole at times, to be quite honest with you. And I think it's okay to say that. We shouldn't be just looking at these people as though they are, again, the heroes that we want to sit at the feet of. So that's for me. That's the message that I want to sort of get across there, and that goes for any of us.
Just basically mindful.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Before we go, Celine, we said we wanted to just quickly read out some of the feedback we've had about the podcast, because we go on about it every week. Please give us a review and talk about what you thought about the podcast and so on, especially on Apple Podcasts. So these are reviews on Apple Podcasts.
Okay, so we've got our first one, which is from the UK, from O. Jackson Writer. Good breadth of info and insight. Really enjoyed the variety of material here. Gives a good rounded perspective on the commonalities of cults and high control groups.
Great. Thank you very much, O. Jackson Writer. Next one is from the US, and actually this is somebody that we know, so I recognise the name there, Celine Shea. So Celine, one of our recent guests. And she says, interesting, informative and important. Really important conversations and insights that are easy to understand and apply to real life. Thank you.
Okay, and then we've got one from Australia, from Joe Ads. Oh, no, from Joe A to Z. A must listen for any cult survivor. Thank you, Stephen and Celine. Such a great podcast. Has helped me make sense of my own journey and acknowledge the trauma I experienced being born into a high control religion and leaving it in my early 20s. Brilliant content and approach. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That's lovely. The next one is also from Australia, and this is from Captain Mapcraft. Great name. A great podcast! ! I really enjoy this pod. It asks the questions I often have and sometimes don't realise I should be asking. I love Stephen's organisational lens he holds. Brilliant. Thank you very much, Captain Mapcraft. I really appreciate that. Cool. And yeah, from Canada, I should say this one is a bit older, but it is. I don't think we've read this one out. So this is actually from 2022, but I wanted to highlight that one from Canada.
So this is Hard Rock Nash, and this is, happy birthday, I love your podcast. I listen to you guys while working and always enjoy the chats. Wish I could chime in sometimes. Keep it up. Entertaining, informative and heartfelt.
Thank you very much, Hard Rock Nash. I don't think we've read that one out before. If we have, well, there you go. I think that's, I don't know for sure, but that name sounds very much like somebody who is an ex-JW who has their own YouTube channel. So I could be wrong, so I don't want to say it, but I think that's them. So thank you. That's always lovely when you get a bit of feedback like that from somebody else that's doing some stuff. Okay, yeah. So thank you very much for all of that. And there you go. You know, if you write a review on Apple Podcasts, we'll read it out. It's so nice to get them, and it's lovely to read them.
And it does help get the podcast around to more people.
Yeah, it's one of those things. You know, the algorithm. The more interaction you get on these things, the more listens it puts in front of more people. And to be honest, with Apple and Spotify, the ratings and the comments on Apple are the only bits of interaction you can get through those platforms. So that is so important. Thank you. And yeah, if you've not done that already, please do. We really appreciate it. And the last thing I wanted to just say very briefly before we wrap up for today is I've kind of not made a massive thing of it because I don't know quite how to do it. But if you remember, about 2 years ago, we spoke to a great guy. He's called Jared Scott. He's an ex-Jehovah's Witness from the States. And I got in touch with him fairly recently, and we've actually started a new podcast. Now, it has nothing to do with Jehovah's Witnesses, really. Both Jared and I work in a very similar business. We both work in leadership and management training in manufacturing. So we're kind of coming from the same place in that respect. And we thought, well, let's do a podcast about leadership and management. So we have created a new podcast called Challenging Leadership. So don't expect any JW or ex-JW or any ex-cult or cult stuff in there, really. Of course, we are talking about some similar concepts and ideas. And who knows, at some point we might sort of delve into that stuff. But it's really more about leadership within the workplace. So we have that on the platforms, the app platforms, but we've also got it on our YouTube channel. So if you want to see us on the YouTube channel, Jared and me, the next one coming up, so we've talked about various different things. We have talked about charisma, interestingly enough. We've also talked about making mistakes as leaders and managers. But the next one coming up is all about leaders and managers in science fiction films and TV, particularly Star Trek. So if you're into Star Trek, then that would be a good one to check out. So yeah, I thought I'd just mention it. If you're interested, the link will be in the show notes. So I reckon that's it, Celine.
Yeah, I think that was very efficient. We're at 1 hour, 1 minute. I think that is very good.
Is that a wrap?
It's a wrap. It's time for me to go get a bagel.
You're going to get bagel. I'm going to get some chili nights.
Lovely, very good.
All right. Well, thank you very much for listening, everybody. Really appreciate it, and see you again next time.
Bye.